This is the Defenders podcast on TV Podcast Industries, and we're exploring Marvel 616, Episode 7, The Marvel Method. Welcome back, fellow Defenders. We are here looking at Episode 7, The Marvel Method of the documentary anthology series Marvel 616. I am one of your hosts, John.
I'm your other host, Derek. It's getting exciting now. We're only a couple of weeks away from WandaVision, John.
I know. Can't wait. 15th of January, and we will be starting our descent into madness.
Yes, I know. And the multiverse of madness. Yes, this is setting up Doctor Strange multiverse of madness, isn't it? And we found out recently it's 9 episodes in WandaVision as well, which we didn't really know when we started covering this series even. We thought it was going to be 6 episodes, so that's kind of cool. But this series that we're doing, the documentary series for Marvel, is because we wanted to dive into a bit of Marvel. We have mentioned it every episode, but we might as well mention it again. Wanted to dive into a bit of Marvel before we got back into WandaVision, because we've been a year off from Marvel when we used to be Defenders TV podcast defending Marvel, and we're going to be jumping into WandaVision on Disney Plus. So we thought, why not jump into a documentary?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we do know that the Scarlet Witch will also be appearing in Doctor Strange, the Multiverse of Madness, because of filming in London or in the UK at the moment. And Elizabeth Olsen is there getting her acting chops all together for that.
Yes, currently in lockdown in the UK, waiting for filming to continue on Doctor Strange.
Yeah.
But this is not about WandaVision. This is not about Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, despite the fact that you might want it to be, John. We are on the 7th episode of Marvel 616, talking about the Marvel Method, a term I've definitely heard many, many times over the years as a comic book fan.
And we should emphasize, this is about writing, nothing else.
Yes, exactly.
It's not like Tantric.
No.
It is about writing.
No, definitely would be a weird documentary in Disney Plus if it was about anything other than Marvel writing.
it really, really would.
But talk to us about this episode, John. What's this one about? What's the kind of focus of this one?
This really surprised me, actually. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but it's really looking at the race against time, actually, by the creative team in place behind Iron Man 2020.
Yeah.
As they use the Marvel Method to create that first issue of the comic. And it has a real nice feel about it. It's like, it's almost like the A-Team coming together to write this comic book. Yeah. And, you've got the writer in Dan Slott. You have Christos Gage, who's brought in as a co-writer to help sort of, work on some of the text with Dan Slott. You have Pete Woods as the artist and Joe Carmagna as the letterer, all overseen by the lead editor, Tom Brevoort. But they've all got their own kind of role, because I suppose arguably, this Marvel method that they're using, really, I suppose it's different from what is termed as the script method, where you write it out as script. So you would have panel 1, the scene, set the scene, write the text, a description of the characters coming in, maybe some background, and it arguably allows for maybe more or a deeper collaborative or co-creation of the comic between all these players, but specifically between the writer and the artist in developing the story. Because what was really interesting was how it starts off with Dan Slott, known for killing off Spider-Man.
Poor dude.
Yeah, exactly.
That's social media stuff, yes.
Exactly, yeah. But it starts off with him, where he writes an outline, essentially, to the artist. So there's no text in there. It's about just outlining the sort of overarching story, where it's set, and those kind of elements.
You say there's no text. There's loads of text in there.
No, there's
no dialogue in there.
But there's no dialogue. There's not really... There's a basic description of what's happening, maybe of the antagonists and protagonists within the story.
It's the feeling and the approach is basically what he says.
Exactly.
I have to say, just to kind of start this off, Dan Slott is such a good host for this, our central kind of focus for this episode. I love just the interplay right at the beginning between himself and Tom Brevoort, who they say they've worked together for almost a quarter of a century, kind of 25 years. They've kind of worked together over the years. And you can tell from the way that it's played, I suppose, from Brevoort kind of going, Dan is terrible with timelines. He's absolutely terrible to hit the mark. And they have that kind of banter between the two of them that you can tell they've worked together for years. Dan Slott is a well-respected writer. He's done so many different books over the years. Very well respected. But seeing this kind of look into the background where he's kind of willing to say, yeah, okay, I do get there in the end, but I am the greatest at timelines, at timekeeping, I suppose. So he uses the Marvel method, one of the last people in Marvel really to use this often.
Yeah.
And it does seem that he uses it the same way Stan Lee used to, which I love, that kind of tying back to why the Marvel method was created, I suppose. Stan Lee used this because he was on every book. So he couldn't possibly write the script for every single book and deliver all the books on time. So he kind of used this collaborative method with the artists. They'd create the art and he'd write word balloons to go along with the art that they created sometimes. He'd give people an outline and they'd run away and do the artwork for the story, and he'd come back and create this really bombastic Stan Lee style over the top of the artwork that would come back, is the way that they've done it. So it seems like, and no criticism to Dan Slott, it seems like the Marvel method is used for people that are slightly more disorganized than people that have...
Or short on time.
Short on time. Yeah, it's short on time.
Which is weird because... it feels pretty intense and maybe a bit more labor intensive because of that communication and involvement and the changes going back and forth between writer, artists, the penciler, the editor. So actually there's a lot of moving parts in this. Maybe not that you don't have the same moving parts on a script, but it's an evolving work, but really from a genesis. It feels more like it's starting from a big bang, whereas the big bang on the script has already happened with the writer.
Yeah.
And it's finessing and nuancing unless there's a real issue with it. And I guess that's how it felt as though it came across here.
Yeah.
So it's weird that it would be used by someone who finds it difficult to stick to the timeline, because it does feel like a real rush. I mean, Tom Brevoort, the lead editor for Iron Man 2020, was just saying, we've burnt into our time buffer that we've had just to do the first issue.
Of the 6-issue run, wasn't it?
Of the 6-issue run. Yeah. Now it's going to be even more time pressure to get them out, because they've absolutely used all that spare time that they had prior to issue 1 being published.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely.
And I agree. I think Tom Brevoort is almost like a really great foil to Dan Slott. And I love how they place Dan Slott into this documentary. You know, he's in this black room trying to write, and you have a writer's block moment with it. And you just see him, you know, typing something out, deleting, changing the words around. So there's a nice feel to it.
I love that they even incorporated the autocorrect when he's trying to spell a word, can't spell it, and has to keep going back and deleting it multiple times. I think it's just a really well put together documentary. It's interesting that this follows the episode that we kind of criticized, the shortest episode of the series that seemed to be missing the kind of end-to-end piece that you do in a documentary, the episode about toys, effectively. And we felt that they were missing a bit where they didn't have the fandom interaction and they didn't have people that actually play with the toys or that side of things. They didn't have the end to end. This is the idea. This is how it's made. This is how it comes to fruition. And this is how it gets to the store kind of thing. This is absolutely sitting down in front of a blank screen and how it gets out into the shops, and it ends with Dan Slott sitting there signing copies of it for his audience. I had to read the comic book directly after watching this. I did get it on Comixology, read this first issue, the Iron Man 2020 storyline, just to see what the finished product was. And it is really interesting. You can see how some of the things they talk about within the Marvel method, how they played out in the final book, because they say that Pete Woods contributes quite a lot to it, because he's doing these amazing scenes or these amazing panels of multiple characters in there, and you can see how it played back into the dialogue. For example, one of the things that I loved, one of the sets of robots that are attacking in this issue are LMDs of Nick Fury, John. So we get traditional old-fashioned Nick Fury in this book again. I haven't seen Nick Fury in a book for years, so seeing the LMDs of Nick Fury in there, really cool touch. There's a scene where we have multiple robots from the history of Marvel all they mention it in the documentary, The 13th Floor. Some of these robots are very famous robots that you haven't seen for years, like Herbie from the Fantastic Four cartoon is in there. I loved that I could now see from seeing this documentary, I love that I can now see how the artwork played back into the writing.
Exactly. Cool. And so that outline by Dan Slott goes to Pete Woods, who was the artist. And in some ways, I suppose, it was a little simpler because he was the penciler, the inker, and the colorist. And he draws effectively the art and the pages of the comic, which I know that sounds weird to say, but that's exactly what he does to the outline. And there's a really nice moment because he wanted to do something with the Iron Man 2020 look. He hated the cogs.
Yes.
He absolutely hated them. And in the back and forth between him and Dan Slott says, no, these are iconic. These have to be on them. It's the only defining feature of Iron Man 2020 are the big shoulder pad cogs. And
so this character of Argo Stark hasn't appeared very much in the comic books. They were saying that there was a storyline done in the 80s going, this is the Iron Man of the absolute future. We'll give him a new name and everything. This is going to be the brother of Tony. And the only thing that people could remember of him was the massive cogs on his outfit. So this isn't an opportunity for the artist Pete Woods to create a new Iron Man suit. This is the opportunity for him to take the old design that was given in the 80s, even though it was terrible, and update it for what it would look like.
But it could have been, but the fact that Dan Slott gave the outline rather than saying he wants cogs on the suit or the character with big cogs on suit, meant that you had that interchange. And, you know, it went to, in the way of retaining the cogs, but it may not have done because the artist, Pete Woods, didn't like them. He said he hated them. And then in getting the notes back from Dan Slott saying, you know, we've got to retain the cogs, he just went, okay, I'll go all out, and did the biggest cogs you can possibly imagine on someone's shoulders. I mean, total 80s
cogs,
thing.
We've got
cogs. We've got cogs. And so, you know, really interesting. The other one was with Christos Gage, where, you know, one of the panels that Pete Woods had done, it was of the main cybernetic villains of the comic book, and it was this huge beast. And, you know, Christos Gage just wrote the text for this and decided that it needed to be included in the art rather than in a text bubble. What it was saying. You also have this back and forth between Christos Gage and Dan Slott, because Christos Gage is writing some of the text for the speech bubbles, and he was putting in a lot of cat puns, which he loves cats. He's got loads of cats, and that just had to be, dare I say it, brought back on the suggestion of Dan Slott, because he said he wanted Dr. Shapiro, who was this very intelligent cat, to think like a cat, not behave as humans thought cats would behave. Exactly. And so there was this kind of interchange going back and forth, and ultimately that interchange is one of where there is a medium between the writer and co-writer in this instance, or the writer, co-writer, and the artist. They come to an accommodation, or they go one way or another. And it felt very, very collaborative. It really did. But as I say, it felt really intense, and you could sense that in some ways this Marvel method, pioneered by Stan Lee with the likes of Jack Kirby, you know, it was born of a pressured situation of having to get a lot of things out, but also one where they're actually in close contact with one another. Either they were in the bullpen or at the Marvel offices. This is happening across the whole of the US. So you've got Christos Gage in LA, you have Dan Slott in New York, and Pete Woods owns a trailer and goes around the country.
That's so cool.
Which is really, really cool. And so he could be anywhere in the US.
Like, as long as I have internet access, I can upload my pages and then do it anywhere. Very cool.
You know, that sense of that remote communication, even just with this lockdown, it's a different way of having to communicate. You know, rather than being effectively Stan Lee in his office and the artists, the inkers, the pencilers, the letterers all just being on the same floor, that you can pop your head round the corner and chat with them or whatever.
And
so,
as we learned earlier
really
on in the documentary series with the Amazing Artisans episode, there are now artists working everywhere in every time zone across the world. Now it's not just the bullpen in New York. Now it's artists working all across the world on all these books. The other thing I'd like to call out as well is that they incorporated the editing process in here as well, where you see Shannon Ballesteros, who's the editor that was responsible for this book, working for Tom Brevoort. But what I found interesting was everybody's under time pressure. As we say, this was just the first issue of 6 that had to be delivered, and the rest of them, they only have a 4-week lead time, effectively. This one they had however long they wanted to, because they knew this book was coming out in 2020, effectively. So could have had 6 months working on this.
Exactly.
One. But I love that you have this final kind of proofread from the editing team who are sitting there looking at the pretty much final version of the book just before it goes to the letterer, and they're making their final changes before it gets produced and before it goes out for publishing, effectively. I like that they incorporated that, because you don't see that side of things very often. It's always talking about the artist, the writers, and then the letterer does get some involvement in a lot of cases, but seeing the editing process, seeing that they have to go through it and say if there's any spelling mistakes, they can only be fixed at one point.
Well, that was it. The interesting thing was of that was that first look, and she was saying this is where the big changes and the big comments need to go, because when it comes to effectively the draft final of it, it is you know, unless there's some kind of car crash, I guess, you can't be making such big changes. But even then, I noticed she was even just making different speech bubbles and sending that back to Joe Comagna, the letterer, to just change up or to put in a different font or whatever, or just slightly different wording to make it clearer or whatever. So it was a fascinating part of it as well.
Absolutely. And I also have to give a shout out to Joe Carmaga, as you mentioned, the letterer for this. I worked in a marketing department for many, many years, and I could feel his pain when he's saying, you know, I'm the letterer, I'm the last person that touches the book. When I produce the PDF copy of it, it goes to the printers from my computer and they start printing effectively. So he's the last person that touches the book, and he's going, what that means is if my cutoff point is 6:30 in the evening, that means I can get changes up until 6:15 in the evening.
Yeah, I know.
And you're kind of feeling that happens regularly. And I can remember it from working in marketing for many years doing advertising, that kind of stuff, where if you tell them, if you give a specific time to the people who are supplying you with all of their requirements, you give them a specific time for cutoff, they're going to use every single second of that. So I hope his actual cutoff time is 7 p.m. maybe.
Yeah, I hope so. But I mean, this is a real recommend. It's a real interesting, kinetic and bit of a mad look at the Marvel method, pioneered by Stan Lee.
It seems really realistic, doesn't it?
It does, though. Well. It really does feel realistic, and I think it's a real interesting insight into the world of, or one way of creating a comic issue and a series. That I suppose has fallen out of favour now. So it's really interesting to see. I
did mention earlier on in this series about the interview I did with Charlie Adlard, the artist on The Walking Dead, for The Walking Dead cast. Go check it out. It's a really fun interview that we did with him. But what I found interesting is that that's the way he collaborated with Robert Kirkman on The Walking Dead. It was a 50-50 split. He did the artwork, Robert Kirkman wrote the story, and together they created the book. They believe there is an absolute 50-50 split, which sounds very much like the Marvel method, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really
there's
does.
a little outline coming back and forth between them. They collaborate on what exactly is going to appear on the page for their audience, effectively. So I was quite intrigued just seeing that that's how they work together. It's interesting. That seems closer to the Marvel method than the other method of here's a script, you give us the artwork, and we'll put the two together.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is that it for this episode of the Marvel method, John?
Yeah, it is. This is a really interesting one. Definitely recommend to check it out for sure.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to be buying the rest of Iron Man 2020 because I really enjoyed the book.
Yeah, I still need to read it, but it sounded good from what you were saying. So yeah, maybe something to check out as well, fellow defenders. Iron Man 2020.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. We will be back for Marvel 616 Episode 8 Spotlight.
Yes.
And, of course, WandaVision on the 15th of January. You can get us and subscribe over at tvpodcastindustries.com. Please rate us, leave a review, and you can search for us on any good or evil podcast catcher of your choice.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us for episode 7 of Marvel 616. Episode 8, Spotlight, is the last episode of our documentary series. Lots of fun doing documentary this time.
Yeah, it's been pretty cool. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us, fellow defenders. As always, it is a pleasure speaking with you. Remember, keep watching, keep listening, and keep defending.
Bye.
Bye.